Now, the Niger state government has announced a donation of 1 billion naira to the victims of the recent flood disaster in Mokwa local area of the state and awarded another 7 billion naira for the construction of Mokwa-Raba Road and 4 bridges earlier washed away. The government announced it will provide 10 trucks each of rice, beans, maize, millet and sorghum to flood victims. 12 days after a flash flood devastated 3 Mokwa communities, killing 206 people and displacing over 4,000, Niger State Governor Umar Bago paid a sympathy visit. The governor was in Saudi Arabia for Hajj at the time of the disaster, but visited the affected areas on June 9th, shortly after returning on the 8th of June. Acting on the federal government's pledge to rebuild over 400 destroyed homes, Governor Bago directed the Ministry of Lands and Surveys to issue a certificate of occupancy immediately.
Of people who are affected will be done. It's chaired by my deputy, and we'll dole out 1 billion naira. And we have a lot of food we have brought out from the stores. Federal government has promised to bring 20 trailers of rice. We are grateful. When it comes, we want NEMA and SEMA to receive them and also handle them accordingly. However, Niger State government is also doling out 10 trucks of rice, 10 trucks of maize, 10 trucks of millet, 10 trucks of beans, and 10 trucks of sorghum to these people. Again, Niger State government understanding the need for connectivity between Mokwa town and Rabat town, we have already awarded the road construction that has 4 bridges from here to Rabat. It is going to cost us 7 billion naira, and we have just awarded it today. So the work will start from tomorrow, and all the bridges will be constructed by Niger State government. We have asked that everybody that lives on the water line, especially where we had the unfortunate flood incidents, to be evacuated.
Well, joining us to discuss the Mokwa flood disaster, where over 200 lives were lost to the devastating flood, how the government can prepare in the case of any subsequent flooding issues that may arise in future, is Dr. Sam Amadi, a Rise News analyst. Good morning, Dr. Amadi, and welcome to the program today.
Thank you. Good morning.
All right, Dr. Amadi, let's get straight into it. It seems this is a case of medicine after death, because the general analysis around this issue seems to be that there were a number of preventative measures that could have been taken. I'd love for you to speak to the ecological fund. Do you think the ecological fund has been dispersed and has been put to good use in Niger State, even with all of the scandals over the past few administrations? And number 2, there are reports that the residents resist evacuation, even when they are given the warnings and so forth. We are being told that many of them don't want to leave, even though they know that the areas are flood prone. How much of this could have been prevented?
Well, thanks so much for having me. First, I think the notion that we are dealing with natural disaster oftentimes exempt us from responsibility, exempt us from even direct and indirect responsibility. But again, natural disasters have, by definition, they're natural, but they're often compounded by lack of foresight, lack of preparedness, lack of strong mitigation factors, and even many times post the occurrence, lack of effective recovery, intervention, and so on and so forth. So first, let's start with the ecological fund. The political economy of funds is that oftentimes financial focus on dealing with disaster or dealing with crisis, kind of, the funds are rarely well used. The bureaucracy around them, if you look at this expenditure from those funds, oftentimes the re-interventions that address the problem is maybe less than 30% of the fund gets to the people in terms of either building the right kind of structures or helping them with embankments and dikes and good infrastructure that will mitigate, reduce the impact of those occurrences. So generally speaking, I think ecological fund has been kind of immersed in corruption ever since, not just this government, but has been the pattern, because essentially, once you have a fund and you don't build good enough governance and accountability framework and protocols for use and assessment and monitoring, you get back to slush fund. But back to the right issue around what could have been done. I think the building collapse council of Niger State issued a statement that actually very, very to the point. He said, look, this is natural, but there were culpability in terms of failure, critical infrastructure failure around that area. Now, we look at the stages dealing with natural disaster, whether in terms of prevention, mitigation, in terms of intervention, recovery. The key thing underlying it is community engagement. And so the element of social capital, value system, engagement, quality of governance, engagement with communities, the level of awareness, advocacy that you do, and also how citizens themselves cooperate with institutions in terms of addressing their vulnerability is critical. If communities refuse to relocate from endangered areas or heed early warning signals from either the NIMET or other meteorological institutions or emergency institutions, it speaks to the fact that perhaps the level of engagement is weak, perhaps social trust is lost, and perhaps people are wedded to traditional notion. I mean, globally, there's a problem getting people to leave their customary places, attachment to culture, religion, burial sites, and for reverent people who are also, at the same time, people who move around, who are nomadic as well. There's a greater complexity on how to get them to leave those areas. Maybe they have their own pattern of predicting when the danger could happen, but what we are dealing with globally is nature against man. There's changes, climate change has imposed some changes, and so patterns that local people observe that trigger to them need to move out may no longer happen that way, and they need to listen to the science. But then, if the governing institutions, if they are not, they don't have moral standing, social capital, trust with the people, then the communities don't listen. So this is the lesson we have to learn in designing how to deal with these communities that are at risk, because you just have to be able to engage them before the risk happens or before it crystallizes, and get them to understand and have trust that when they get relocated, that they're going to go to, when things are over, they're going back, and government itself is credible to believe that government will intervene and intervene well. So we are dealing with total loss of public trust, and the damage is that even when society, it is in the interest of communities to heed government warning and cooperate with government institutions, you see very limited support and cooperation with government, and the result will be is tragedy, as we saw with over 580 houses destroyed. And again, if you look at those houses, that's a part of the report. If you look at the fragility, the quality of the embankments, the dams, the infrastructure, even the railway roads that compounded the impact of this flooding, everything speaks about low standard, poor governance, and poor assessment of risk and preventive actions, both on the part of government and the people themselves.
Okay. Now, when the Vice President visited the Mokwa local government area, he pledged federal government's commitment of 2 billion naira to help rehabilitate the people, to restore damaged infrastructure. 4 bridges collapsed in the course of that flooding tragedy. Are you aware if there is any mechanism in place to ensure accountability in the management of the relief materials and the 2 billion naira that the federal government has promised? Second, Meteorological Agency, NIMET, has said there will be a challenge of flooding in 15 other states this year during this rainy season. Rainy season in Nigeria is April to October. Now, they say to be forewarned is to be forearmed. What do you think those affected states that have been identified and properly named should do to provide the kind of tragedy we have witnessed in Mokwa? Because this flooding occurs perennially. And each time it happens, we just lament. Absolutely. And we move on until the next rainy season.
Yeah, I think great questions, two of them. First is that I'm not aware, maybe there is now a measure. What I know from experience, both working in government and working outside government, is that we're not very strong on safeguards. We are more concerned with allocation. So we throw money at problem. Yeah, I thank government for providing those allocations. But the key point is the structure for administration. First, we're not a too numerate people. We don't even have numbers. We're struggling with numbers in terms of, for example, we see an estimate of 580 homes damaged, alleged, with about 100 or 200 or more persons dead. So you need to have first accurate number around who is involved. You need to also understand, identify victims at the level of victimhood that needs some level of compensation and rehabilitation as the case might be. Again, you have to have a system that is transparent and accountable, that people can, after the fact, go back and audit money trail each of the payments. I mean, small operations like NSAS, that happened and the governor wanted to help compensate some people. We're still dealing with allegations of corruption. People are alleging that people who are not even involved in any way with any of those instances got compensated. People who were victims don't. So the political economy comes in again here. Is government willing to pay attention and design a process? Take their time, design a process to make sure that these funds get to the people who need them. Oftentimes, the motivation is the soundbite. Okay, 2 billion, government has discharged its responsibility. And government doesn't follow through with how these funds get to compensate, rehabilitate, and they don't go back and evaluate what perhaps the local agency that receives this fund does with that. Or in terms of local agencies, the state, they don't even go down and look at the communities and say, have people been compensated? So that's a problem we're going to deal with. I'm not sure that's a new device that can solve that problem. Now, back to this issue of, what we do with early warnings. Again, part of strategy for dealing with natural disaster is what they call preparedness. And that's, first, you have to develop people's capability, whether in terms of response agencies, whether in terms of prevention, building resilience. There are some disasters, that's what they call natural. We know that if the rains might be heavy this year, we can't stop them from being heavy. But we can now go around building plans, look at our infrastructure, look at our communities, look at things that have to be done. And even the preparedness and coordination drills so that those who are going to intervene, think about flooding. And then it takes you like 4 hours to intervene. By the time you intervene, for example, the escape routes have been closed. It becomes more difficult to evacuate people and to save lives or to prevent loss of property. So the point is that we lack the capabilities that we need. We don't prepare ahead of time. And the capacity to trigger that capability at the right time. The level of coordination, the level of vigilance. And again, it comes to executive attention. Do we really have that intelligence? Oftentimes we think we have the intelligence because we have people who have degrees, where people are called meteorologists, people are called scientists. But the intelligence, the real intelligence matters is the capacity to deploy and the preparedness over time that these people are ready. They understand the signal, they understand the warning signal, and they're able to move in and trigger and coordinate at scale. That's the capability we don't have. So you are right. These states that are indicated that they're going to have problems, do they have units that are studying this? Do they have even scientific reports that tell them the severity, that shows them their vulnerability? There was an office in the VP's office last government, I don't know whether I stayed there, headed by one smart guy, which is called a climatic preparedness unit. Are we deploying, are we investing in knowledge systems that tell us our vulnerabilities in very clear, actionable points and prepare us ahead? So I'll be surprised to hear that any of these states are already having executive meetings with their senior team, designing protocols, engaging units and saying, what should we do to make sure that when this landfall hits us, we will escape the impact others are having. We've had flood in the past. We had in Lokoja that was about 4 or 5 years ago, was really deadly. If it happens again now, if you go back there, you will not see what has changed in terms of both the structure and non-structural, interventions, in terms of culture, in terms of early one, in terms of getting the people to understand various signals that will tell them what to do. You won't even find perhaps easy corridor of escape government has prepared and say, when this happens, this is what we're going to do. So really, it's a function of failure of governance at the level that it matters, which is the level of dealing with vulnerabilities and risk and hazard that people face every day. politics, and the optics of it drowns out the real, not sexy work that you do in governance, which is really desktop studies, research, analysis, scoping, and even hydrological risk mapping. And then you put them together, and then you say, this is going to happen to us. This is how we're going to mitigate it. That's why you look all over the world. Some of this natural disasters happen elsewhere. The fatalities are small. Why? Because the people know what to do, and the institutions are willing to intervene with the right professionalism to reduce fatalities, both in terms of human life and perhaps damage to property and environment.
Dr. Amadi, the conversation around climate change in Nigeria for some strange reason has waned. In fact, the silence is deafening. I know we gained quite a bit of momentum with the former Vice President, Professor Osinbajo, who was particularly passionate about the cause of climate change. And, he went around the world and tried to get Nigeria more involved in sort of the global plans around climate change. Just, from your understanding of what's currently happening in our politics in relation to geopolitics as well, why do you think the enthusiasm around us keying into some of these climate change initiatives and tapping into that part of the ecosystem? Because ultimately this is climate change related, but we're no longer hearing these conversations taking place in Nigeria. What's going on?
Well, I think two things. No matter what we say about President Muhammadu Buhari, I think he was really genuinely passionate or concerned about environmental risks and disaster. I mean, coming from a region where deforestation, climate change was one of the, driving factor for haters, conflict, and attacks on farming communities. So I think in a way there's some kind of genuine commitment, and of course that reflected in the appointment of now Deputy Secretary of the UN, Amina, who manned the environment desk and the Great Green Wall and all those interventions. And again, Professor Osinbajo has the, just to be fair, the intelligence to really understand the conversations going on globally and had an interest. And like I said, he had an office. He brought an office that was basically around preparedness. So genuine commitment, genuine concern, and enough intelligence to follow the conversation and understand what it means long-term for Nigeria's economic and social sustainability. Look, we're talking about economic growth today. In the global discourse of economic development, you have to factor in sustainability. And sustainability has to deal with also how you're going to, your exposure to environmental risk and your fragility, not just in terms of wars, in terms of maybe conflicts, but also in terms of environmental impacts and environmental disaster, which may have a bigger toll on economic prospect long-term than even wars and conflicts. So I think that's what is missing now is that the kind of politics or the governance, focus is more around, politicking to, perhaps deal with winning more constituents in terms of there's not enough bandwidth, in my understanding, dealing with these other hardcore issues around sustainability. Again, I think the Buhari administration had less concern about maybe political prospects. Buhari was a little bit more secured electorally than the current government. And when you are a government that is challenged, I mean, the tendency is to allow politics to crowd out governance because you really have to deal with the pressure. So this government is pressured and it's not finding enough bandwidth to deal with these other issues that do not immediately impact on political outcome, but has very disastrous long-term impact for the country's survival and this prospect of economic development. So I think it's both politics, both lack of genuine concern and perhaps lack of the intellectual capability and awareness of what's going on globally in this subject matter and the risk that we have. Again, even though climate change is now a little bit immersed in politics around the neo-environmentalists and those who are environmental skeptics, but the reality is that we in the Africa world, the third world countries are the ones who are going to suffer the risk more. And therefore, there's need for us not to play the politics as much, but to focus on how do we build resilience? How do we insulate ourselves, mitigate this harm, protect ourselves as man struggles with nature. We saw the pandemic. We're talking about zoological leap. Some people are talking about the fact that we're going to enter into an era of two things: conflict over water, over natural resources, and conflict, struggle against nature, which is really the adverse consequence of perhaps overdevelopment, urbanization, and all that go with aggressive economic development. So I think we need to get back to put some bandwidth around this subject matter, even as we work hard to deal with the political pressure that government is dealing with. But I think the past government was much more committed to these discussions because they perhaps feel the need coming from northern Nigeria, and also Shibanjo has more intellectual sensitivity to the issues involved.
Okay, Dr. Amadi, before we let you go, I just need a small clarification. You made the point that the former vice president, Professor Shibanjo, has the intelligence to understand the issues about climate change and all that. Are you by any sense suggesting that the people who are in charge now do not have the intelligence that is required to understand the issues involved? Because we have a Minister of Environment appointed by President Tinubu. I think his name is Balarabe Lawal Abbas. We also have somebody in charge of NESTRIA, which is the Standards Regulations Agency of Nigeria, one Dr. Innocent Bariko. I've read reports they've been going to conferences, either EU or US. They go to, are you saying they don't have the intelligence to bring the same level of competence that we saw under the Buhari administration? Is that what you were suggesting?
Well, my answer will be very simple, that intelligence comes in different colors and
you also use the word capability. You also use the word capability. So take the two together.
Yeah, what I mean, What I mean by Shibanjo, I mean clearly, not because he's a professor of law, but you see, what are you sensitive to? For example, you can gather some politicians and you're talking about maybe contract, maybe infrastructure, maybe how to build roads. You can gather some other people that are thinking around perhaps how do we ensure that what's happening to global geopolitics? How does Trump, I imagine, reshape our understanding of trade and our economic development? So these are different levels of intelligence. I think it'd be fair to say that perhaps because of exposure, because of his own connections with different centers of intellectual activity, I think that Shibanjo's office, I mean, they had their own inefficiencies, and I criticize that a lot in terms of manning level. But I think they had more sensitivity, that's the right word I want to use, sensitivity, and openness perhaps to look at this data, think around what do we do. For him to even have set up that office of preparedness shows that he understood what we're talking about. Now, capability, what I mean is that I'm not even doing comparative. I'm saying that, for example, if you look at states, you can ask yourself, what your data were capability? What do we have to deal with these challenges in terms of human intelligence, in terms of the civil service, in terms of our agencies, look, I've been in the civil service, I've worked in the government, and I can tell you that our capability to deal with anything, whether it's electricity, whether it's disaster, is perhaps 20% or not more. It's not about, oh, this person has been pumped for 20 years. The issue is, do you have the people who understand the risk? Do you have the system that triggers them? Do you have the professionalism that makes them respond in the way you calibrate or you expect? So the capabilities are very low, and that's actually what defines underdevelopment. I mean, there is a branch of study of development called effectiveness, and it goes to argue that if you look at what has worked, you see that people have built around capabilities around that subject matter. Capabilities are not kind of natural. You design the idea you want, the problem you want to solve, how to solve it, and you make sure you put together capabilities that people have different capabilities that can address it. And then you also have the capacity to trigger it, because you can have capabilities, but the political economy, and that's where being the president or vice is important. I mean, you can be a minister, maybe you have capacity, but you need to have that level. So I'm saying, yes, I saw more of that sensitivity intellectually to climate risk under Shibanjo than under,
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Amadi, for joining us on the morning show.